In a tobacco barn in central Virginia, 17 enslaved men entered on Saturday nights between 1837 and 1839. Only 3 were ever officially recorded as dead. The other 14 disappeared from all records, their names erased, their existence forgotten, their fate buried under decades of silence. What occurred inside that barn was not farming. It was not punishment. It was entertainment. Wealthy plantation owners arrived in covered carriages after dark, carrying more money than most would see in a lifetime. All of it was bet on one question: which man would walk out alive, and which would be carried out in pieces. These fights were never about discipline or control, they were about profit. And the rules were simple. There were none. No stopping, no mercy, no escape until one man could no longer stand. This is the story of how one plantation owner turned human beings into gladiators, how Saturday nights became execution spectacles disguised as sport, and how the 17 men who vanished were destroyed, not by disease or accident, but by something calculated and profitable. Before we continue with the story of Nathaniel Devo and the 17 names erased from his ledgers, do one thing for me. If this is your first time exploring stories that reveal the darkest corners of American history, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. Then comment below with the state you're listening from. I want to know where you are as we uncover what truly happened in those tobacco fields. This is not legend or speculation. Evidence exists in fragmented property records, testimonies decades later from survivors, and in unmarked graves discovered when the land was cleared in 1911. Cumberland County, Virginia, in 1837, was a place where tobacco still ruled as king, though the soil was beginning to tire. The plantations that had thrived in the previous century now faced declining yields, forcing landowners to seek new sources of income or risk financial ruin. The county's geography offered isolation yet accessibility. Far enough from Richmond to avoid scrutiny, close enough to waterways to maintain commerce, secluded enough that what happened on private land stayed private. The Devo plantation spanned nearly 800 acres, mostly tobacco, with sections of corn and wheat. Nathaniel Devo inherited the property in 1829, along with 43 enslaved people, significant debts, and a reputation for harshness cultivated by his father over decades. Nathaniel was 31 when he assumed control. A thin man with dark, unfashionably long hair, a sharp nose, and eyes described by servants as always calculating. He spent his 20s gambling in Richmond and Norfolk private clubs. He observed men's wagers, learned to provoke excitement, and understood how to loosen purses. When his father died, creditors arrived, and Nathaniel returned to Cumberland County with empty pockets and a mind full of schemes. The enslaved community lived in 2 rows of cabins behind the main house. Rough clay-walled, dirt-floored structures where families slept in barely adequate spaces. They worked the tobacco from March to November under the oversight of Garrett Sutcliffe, a nearly 50-year-old overseer with a barrel-like frame and scarred hands, who used a hickory stick both for support and discipline. Within the enslaved community, hierarchy existed. House servants, 3 women and an elderly man, enjoyed relative privilege while field hands endured harshest conditions. Skilled laborers, however, held special value. Benjamin, the blacksmith, and Marcus, the carpenter, among others. Benjamin, central to what followed, was over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders, strong hands, and remarkable skill in both metalwork and fine carpentry. Born on the plantation, he lost his mother young, and his father was sold away when he was 12. Quiet and diligent, he earned respect even from Sutcliffe, who avoided striking him for fear of damaging his talent. In the spring of 1837, Nathaniel Devo faced a crisis. The previous year's tobacco crop had suffered from an early frost, leaving profits insufficient to cover half of his debts. Creditors, mainly Richmond merchants, threatened foreclosure. Proud of his cunning and his ability to solve problems through schemes rather than honest labor, Nathaniel sat in his father's study, surrounded by failing account books, and began to see his assets differently. He owned land, but land required labor to generate profit, and labor required capital he did not have. He owned enslaved people, but their value was only theoretical until he sold them, and selling them would hasten the plantation's collapse. What Nathaniel needed was immediate income that didn't deplete his resources. money that flowed directly to him, bypassing the uncertainties of agriculture. The idea came in May, during a conversation with his neighbor, planter Harrison Fentress. They sat on Devo's porch, drinking whiskey as the evening cooled, discussing their financial struggles. Fentress mentioned attending a gathering in Lynchburg where men had bet on a fight between two enslaved men. An event unlike boxing, he clarified, his words slurred by drink. No rules, no stopping until one couldn't continue. Crude entertainment, yes, but the wagers were extraordinary. I heard the house took in over $300 that night, Fentress said. Nathaniel said nothing, but his mind was already working. That night, lying in his father's old bed, staring at the ceiling, he reached a decision by dawn. Late in June, on a Saturday evening, Nathaniel gathered 6 of his strongest field hands in the old tobacco barn. Once used for drying and storage, it now stood mostly empty, isolated nearly a quarter-mile from the slave quarters and even farther from the main house, surrounded by oaks that muffled sound. Benjamin was among the 6, summoned from his forge by Sutcliffe and told to bring his tools. The others were field hands. Isaac, a quick 20-year-old. Daniel, older and cautious. Joseph, Samuel, and Robert, whose individual details are lost to history, but whose presence that night sealed their fates. Nathaniel stood in the center of the cleared barn floor, Sutcliffe beside him with his hickory stick. 2 lanterns hung from the rafters, casting long shadows across the dirt. The men formed a rough semicircle, confused and anxious as darkness fell. I have work for you, Nathaniel said, his voice false in friendliness, heightening their unease. Different work. Better work in some ways. You'll be compensated, not with money, of course, but with privileges. Better food, less time in the fields, perhaps even tobacco. He paused, reading their faces, noting suspicion mixed with desperate hope. What I need, he continued, is a demonstration of strength, a test of skill. Benjamin stepped forward, expression neutral. Nathaniel addressed him. You're the strongest man on this plantation. Everyone knows it. But is Isaac faster? Is Daniel tougher? I want to find out. Here's what will happen. You and Isaac will fight a real fight. The winner gets better rations for a month and no field work. The loser returns to regular duties. Simple. The silence was heavy. These men had lived long enough under slavery to know that nothing was simple, and promises from a master often hid danger. Yet refusal was not an option. Benjamin looked at Isaac, who wouldn't meet his eyes. Isaac, young and lean, skilled with his hands in delicate work like tying tobacco leaves, could have been Benjamin's son. The thought of fighting him tightened Benjamin's stomach. I don't want to fight, he said quietly. Nathaniel's false friendliness vanished. I don't recall asking what you want. Sutcliffe. Remind Benjamin what happens when my instructions are questioned. Sutcliffe stepped forward, hickory stick raised. Benjamin spoke again. I'll fight. What followed lasted perhaps 10 minutes, though for witnesses it felt much longer. Benjamin and Isaac circled each other on the dirt floor while Nathaniel and Sutcliffe watched. No rules were given, no boundaries set. Just the understanding that they should fight until Nathaniel was satisfied. Isaac struck first, a quick jab to Benjamin's jaw. Benjamin barely moved. He outweighed Isaac by 50 pounds and tried not to hurt him, but Isaac continued, driven by fear of what refusal might bring. Benjamin defended himself, pushing Isaac without force, trying to end the fight without injury. Nathaniel was unsatisfied. This is pathetic, he said. A real fight. If I don't see blood in the next minute, both of you get 20 lashes and a week in the root cellar. The threat changed everything. Isaac attacked with desperate intensity and Benjamin, seeing no way to protect them both, finally struck. A solid blow to Isaac's midsection, dropping him to his knees, gasping. Benjamin moved to help him up, but Sutcliffe pushed him back. Nathaniel crouched beside Isaac, inspecting him like livestock. Adequate, he said. This will work. Saturday nights from now on we'll have these contests. I'll invite friends. There will be betting, and winners will be rewarded. As the men filed out, Benjamin heard Nathaniel tell Sutcliffe, next week invite Fentress and perhaps the Quincaid brothers. Start with modest stakes. We'll build from there. That night, in his cabin, Benjamin told his woman, Sarah, what had happened. Sarah, a small but fierce field hand who had survived 3 children being sold before age 30, listened silently, her face hardening. He's going to kill someone, Sarah said when Benjamin finished telling her. Maybe not, Benjamin replied, though he didn't believe it. He will, Sarah insisted. Men who bet crave excitement. Excitement leads to violence, and violence eventually kills someone. It's only a matter of time. She was right, though it took several months for the inevitable to occur. Saturday night fights became a fixture on the Devo plantation throughout the summer and fall of 1837. Word spread discreetly among Cumberland County's planters, through private conversations and hand-delivered notes, that Nathaniel Devo was hosting events more thrilling than the usual card games or horse races. Men began arriving after dark in covered carriages, entering via a back road that avoided the main gate. They parked near the tobacco barn, where lanterns now burned every Saturday evening. The fights quickly evolved to meet audience demands. What began as simple matches between 2 men expanded into a structured system. Nathaniel kept meticulous records in a leather-bound journal. Wins and losses, physical condition, willingness to fight. He ranked fighters and scheduled matches to generate the most betting interest. Benjamin fought 6 times between June and October, winning 4 and losing 2. The losses were deliberate, calculated to keep him useful without making him dangerously dominant. He learned to read Nathaniel's moods, to gauge when a fight needed to appear intense or could be brief. He tried to protect other fighters whenever possible, ending matches quickly to minimize real harm. Despite this, the money flowing into Nathaniel's pockets grew substantial. On good nights with 20 to 30 spectators, total bets could reach $400 to $500, and Nathaniel took a percentage of every wager. He also charged $5 admission per gentleman and sold whiskey at inflated prices. Within 3 months, he had paid off pressing debts and began expanding the operation. Nathaniel purchased 2 more enslaved men specifically for fighting. Both were young, strong, and had reputations for resistance. Named Thomas and William, they arrived in chains, their defiance considered an advantage. Men with nothing to lose would fight fiercely. But Nathaniel's enterprise faced a fundamental problem. The fighters were also laborers. Injuries in the barn meant lost productivity in the fields. Every incapacitated fighter represented depreciated capital. Nathaniel needed them to perform in the barn while remaining functional as workers, a tension that would drive him toward increasingly reckless decisions. The first serious injury occurred in October. Samuel, one of the original 6, suffered a head injury during a match that left him confused and unsteady. He continued working, but his behavior became erratic, stopping mid-task, staring into space, becoming disoriented. Sutcliffe reported this to Nathaniel, who observed him for a few days before deciding, "He's useless in the fields, can't follow instructions, can't remember tasks. He costs me money every day he eats. Put him in the isolation cabin and reduce his rations. Maybe hunger will sharpen his mind." The isolation cabin was a windowless structure, barely large enough to stand, originally built for storing seed corn. Samuel spent 3 weeks there on quarter rations before he died. The official record listed the cause as fever and decline. No doctor examined him. No investigation occurred. His name was crossed out of Nathaniel's ledger, his few possessions distributed among the remaining enslaved people, and his absence noted only in the sudden silence where his voice had been. This death could have been a warning, a moment to reconsider the enterprise. Instead, it taught Nathaniel a different lesson. He could dispose of fighters who became too damaged to be useful, the county would not investigate closely, and enslaved people could vanish from official records without consequence. This realization would prove catastrophic. The fights continued through winter, though less frequently due to the cold. Nathaniel used this period to refine the operation. He installed a raised platform along one wall for wealthier spectators, spread sawdust on the dirt floor to absorb blood and ease cleanup, and developed formal betting systems inspired by the gambling houses of Richmond. He kept detailed records of fighters' performance, style, pain tolerance, recovery time, and temperament under pressure. Nathaniel treated the fights like a business, optimizing profit and efficiency. Benjamin, observing from his position as a primary fighter, understood the escalation. Fights lasted longer, injuries were more severe, and the crowd developed a taste for violence. Spectators who had initially hesitated now shouted encouragement, betting on how long fighters would stay conscious. During work at his forge, Benjamin began hiding small amounts of money, coins dropped by spectators in the sawdust. He had no clear plan but instinctively knew he would need resources for an eventual opportunity to resist or escape. Sarah, his partner, made her own preparations. She cultivated relationships with house servants, learning everything she could about Nathaniel's movements, habits, and weaknesses. She noted when he drank heavily, which visitors stayed late, and where he kept important papers. Though illiterate, she understood that knowledge was power and gathered every scrap she could. By spring 1838, nearly a year after the first fight, Saturday night matches had become Nathaniel's primary source of income. The plantation itself continued to decline. Tobacco yields dropped, equipment broke without repair, and fields that should have been rotated were repeatedly planted until exhausted. Nathaniel no longer thought of himself as a planter. He had become something else entirely. Nathaniel had become more than a planter. He was a purveyor of entertainment, an organizer of spectacle, a man who had discovered that blood and suffering could be more profitable than crops. By April 1838, his transformation was complete when a visitor arrived from Lynchburg, Crawford Hastings, a man in his 50s who ran several businesses of questionable legality in that growing city. Hastings had heard of the Devo fights through Virginia's network of gamblers and sporting enthusiasts and came with a proposal. They met in Nathaniel's study on a Tuesday afternoon. Hastings, heavy-set and dressed in expensive but slightly worn clothes, set a leather case on the desk before speaking. "I've run similar operations for years," he said. "In Baltimore, Richmond, Lynchburg, the problem is always the same. You start with simple matches. The crowd grows. Money increases. Then the audience gets bored. They've seen two men fight. They want more." Nathaniel leaned back. "What kind of more?" "Higher stakes," Hastings said. "Not just who wins or loses, but life and death. Matches where losing means everything." He paused, watching Nathaniel. "You're already close to this. I heard about the man who died last fall. That wasn't an accident, was it?" Nathaniel said nothing. Hastings opened his leather case and pushed a ledger across the desk. "These are my records from the past 3 years. Look at the revenue when mortality is real. Men will bet extraordinary amounts when they believe they're witnessing genuine danger. Some matches end without death. Some don't. The uncertainty drives betting." Nathaniel studied the figures. Hastings was generating 4 to 5 times the revenue Nathaniel currently made, all by embracing the logical endpoint of their enterprise. "You're talking about deliberately killing them," Nathaniel said carefully. "I'm talking about creating conditions where death is likely," Hastings corrected. "You don't murder them yourself. You match fighters, remove usual constraints, offer a substantial reward to the winner, and let nature take its course. Some survive, some don't. That's what drives the profit." Hastings leaned forward. "I can help you set this up properly. I have connections with wealthy men across the state who will come here. We could triple your profits in 2 months, but you must accept the consequences." Nathaniel spent 3 days considering the proposal. Morality barely troubled him. He had long rationalized that enslaved people were property, that their suffering was an economic cost, and that financial survival justified any action. Practical risk concerned him more. Bodies were harder to dispose of than paperwork errors, and too many deaths might attract scrutiny, even in lightly supervised Cumberland County. Hastings had solutions. Varying fighters so no single man disappeared too often, staging deaths as accidents, bribing clerks to overlook records, and disposing of bodies with no evidence. His system was refined through years of practice. Nathaniel agreed to the partnership on Saturday morning. That evening, the fights changed forever. The first match under the new system involved Thomas and William, the 2 men Nathaniel had purchased for fighting, both strong and defiant. The barn held over 40 spectators, including several Hastings had brought from Lynchburg. Nathaniel addressed the crowd. "Gentlemen, tonight's contest will proceed without the usual constraints. Fighters continue until one cannot continue. No intervention, no mercy. Bet accordingly." The fight lasted 43 minutes, exceeding even the worst expectations of those who supported escalation. Thomas lay unconscious on the sawdust floor, his face barely recognizable, while William stood over him, hands bloody, shaken, unable to comprehend what he had done. Thomas survived 6 more days, never fully conscious, before dying in the isolation cabin. His death was recorded as consumption and decline. He was buried in an unmarked grave in the woods beyond the fields, known only to Sutcliffe and 2 enslaved men forced to dig it, sworn to silence under threat of the same fate. The money generated that night surpassed any previous earnings. Hastings had brought wealthy spectators willing to bet some field hands could not earn in a lifetime. Nathaniel's share totaled nearly $800, more than any tobacco harvest had ever yielded. Benjamin, forced to watch, understood clearly. This was no longer fighting. This was execution disguised as sport. Every man in the barn was now living on borrowed time. Nathaniel had crossed a threshold, and the only question was who would die next and how long the others would survive. That night, Benjamin told Sarah, "I need you to act. There's a woman, Rachel, who works in the Fentress house 3 plantations south. She knows free black people in Lynchburg who help people escape. You need to get word to her. Not just for me. For everyone in this barn on Saturday nights." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "You know what they do to those who try to run." "I know what they do to those who stay," Benjamin said. Between April and August 1838, 6 more enslaved men died from injuries sustained in Nathaniel's barn. Not all immediately. Some lingered for days or weeks, succumbing to internal injuries, infections, or damage that slowly ended their capacity to survive. Each death was officially recorded as something else: fever, heart failure, accident, consumption. County records showed nothing unusual, and the plantation ledgers reflected only a declining number of enslaved laborers, easily attributed to sale or natural causes. Hastings now arrived in Cumberland County every Saturday, bringing new spectators and expanding the network of men willing to pay for this specific form of entertainment. The barn, which held about 50 spectators, was regularly full. Betting pools grew larger, sometimes exceeding $1,000. Nathaniel earned more than the plantation had in its most profitable years and reinvested part of the income into the operation. Better lanterns, a second platform for premium seating, even a separate discreet entrance for certain guests. Yet the operation created problems money couldn't solve. The enslaved community lived in constant terror, knowing anyone could be selected for the next fight. Refusal meant punishment. Winning only guaranteed another fight. Fieldwork slowed as workers moved with a hollow-eyed desperation, watching and waiting to see who would disappear next. Benjamin had fought twice more under the new system, winning both matches by using speed and strategy, ending fights before they reached the worst extremes. He knew, however, that this couldn't last. He was 30 years old, and younger, faster, more desperate men were now being brought into the barn. Eventually, someone would outmatch him, he would make a mistake, or Nathaniel would decide he was too valuable or too costly to keep alive. Sarah had successfully contacted Rachel at the Fentress Plantation, who relayed information about free black people in Lynchburg willing to help, but escape came at extreme risk. The route north spanned nearly 40 miles, crossing rivers, avoiding patrols, and requiring precise timing. Benjamin couldn't go alone. If he ran, Sarah would suffer in his place. They would need allies, other men willing to risk everything. Benjamin quietly approached the other fighters, gauging their willingness. Some were too terrified to consider it, others too angry to think clearly. A few listened. William, scarred and changed after killing Thomas. Isaac, the young man from the first fight, now marked by past injuries, and Elijah, recently purchased and not yet fully broken. In whispered conversations behind the barn during rare unsupervised moments, Benjamin outlined the plan. "It won't be easy," he told them. "Most people who run don't make it, But everyone who stays here will die. Maybe not next week, maybe not next month, but eventually we are more profitable dead than alive. You understand? William nodded slowly. When? He asked. Within the month, Benjamin replied. There's a route north and people to hide us. Timing is everything. When Nathaniel is distracted, the barn is full, and spectators are drunk, paying attention to the fights instead of the quarters. Before they could finalize the plan, an unforeseen event disrupted everything. On a Saturday night in mid-August, during a fight between two men whose names were not recorded, a spectator, a wealthy Lynchburg planter named Theodore Marsden, suffered a fatal stroke. He collapsed, clutching his chest, and died within minutes despite attempts at revival. The crowd panicked. Suddenly, men accustomed to watching enslaved people die were confronted with the death of one of their own, shattering their illusion of safety. Several spectators left immediately, leaving Nathaniel facing a new problem. Marsden had been one of Hastings' most reliable contacts, and his death threatened to draw attention, questions, even investigation. Hastings and Nathaniel met late that night in the barn, surrounded by sawdust, blood, and lantern smoke. This is a problem, Hastings said. Marsden's family will want answers. They're prominent. We can't just say he had a stroke. What do you suggest? Nathaniel asked. Shut down for a month or two. Let this settle. Come up with a story. He was looking at horses, discussing tobacco. Something legitimate. Nathaniel shook his head. I can't afford to shut down. I need the Saturday night revenue. I spent too much expanding this operation. You're a fool, Hastings said. This draws investigation. Keep running the fights, and questions will come we can't answer. They argued for another hour before Hastings left, frustrated and concerned. Nathaniel stayed in the barn, weighing options. He decided not to shut down. Instead, he would accelerate. Run fights every Saturday for the next month, generate maximum revenue, and afterward, if necessary, sell the plantation and leave Cumberland County. That final month of income was essential. Unbeknownst to Nathaniel, Benjamin and the others had moved up their escape timeline. They planned to flee on the first Saturday in September, during fight night, when attention would be focused on the barn and spectators, leaving the quarters less guarded. Contacts in Lynchburg had promised shelter, and the route north had been identified. The first Saturday in September 1838 arrived, unusually cool after August's heat. Nathaniel scheduled 3 fights, expecting a full crowd despite lingering tension after Marsden's death. While some spectators stayed away, enough remained, drawn by the Devo barn's reputation and the promise of extreme violence. Benjamin was scheduled to fight in the final match against Jacob, a newly purchased man known for size and strength. Benjamin had seen Jacob fight before. He knew the challenge would be severe. Jacob was younger, heavier, and had nothing to lose, making him extremely dangerous. But Benjamin did not intend to fight that night. By the time his match was due, he and the others would be miles away, moving through darkness toward the first checkpoint on the route to freedom. The plan was simple in concept but difficult in execution. During the second fight, when the barn was full and attention focused on the center, Benjamin, William, Isaac, and Elijah would slip away from the holding area and begin their escape. Sarah and 3 other women who had agreed to risk everything waited at a predetermined spot behind the old corn crib. From there, the group planned to head north, avoiding main roads, moving through forests and fields, aiming to cover about 15 miles before dawn. They had one key advantage. Their absence wouldn't be noticed until Benjamin failed to appear for his scheduled fight, by which time they would have at least an hour's head start. Nathaniel would be drunk by the third fight, as was always the case, and Sutcliffe would be occupied managing the crowd, collecting bets and maintaining order. The other enslaved people on the plantation knew what was happening but would say nothing. They had too much to lose and nothing to gain from betraying the escape attempt. The first 2 fights proceeded as planned. Benjamin and the others waited in the holding area, separated by a canvas curtain, listening to the sounds beyond. The crowd shouting, the impact of flesh on flesh, the occasional scream. As the second fight neared its end, they made their move. Benjamin led, slipping through a gap in the barn's rear wall that he had deliberately widened during his work as a blacksmith. William followed, then Isaac, and finally Elijah. They moved across the open ground behind the barn, crouched in shadows, heading toward the corn crib where Sarah and the women waited. But something went wrong. A house servant named Meg, who hadn't been informed of the plan due to concerns about her loyalty, noticed movement and panicked. Having witnessed punishment for far less suspicious behavior, she likely believed reporting it was self-preservation. She told Sutcliffe, who immediately understood the situation. He went to the holding area, found it empty, and rushed to Nathaniel, who stood with a glass of whiskey, watching the second fight. "They've run," Sutcliffe said quietly. Benjamin and at least 3 others were missing. Nathaniel's expression shifted instantly from drunken pleasure to cold fury. "Get the dogs. Wake the overseer and tell him we're paying for his services tonight. Round up every man willing to ride and offer $50 to whoever brings them back. Move now." Within 15 minutes, the barn had emptied. Men mounted horses, dogs were unleashed, and bloodhounds trained to track human scent were set loose. Saturday night's entertainment had become a manhunt. Benjamin and the others were 1.5 miles away when the first dog's bang echoed through the distance. Moving through a pine forest along a creek that would help mask their scent, the sound of pursuit was unmistakable. "They know already," Sarah gasped between breaths. "We didn't get enough time." Benjamin made a quick decision. "Split up. William, take Elijah and head northeast toward Lynchburg Road. The rest of us go north through the wetlands. They can't track both groups equally." William nodded and veered away with Elijah. Benjamin led Sarah, Isaac, and the 3 women toward swampy terrain difficult for horses and dogs to navigate. For an hour, they ran, lungs burning, legs trembling. Pursuit sounds grew louder and fainter as the hunting parties spread across the countryside. They crossed 2 more creeks, pushed through dense underbrush, and entered an old-growth forest where the thick canopy blocked moonlight. Just before midnight, they reached the swamp, a treacherous wetland avoided by locals, filled with sinkholes and quicksand, water varying from knee-deep to neck-deep. Benjamin had learned of this area from other enslaved people, who had mapped dangerous terrain as protection and strategy. "Through the swamp," Benjamin said. "It's the only way to lose the dogs for sure." They waded into cold, vegetation-thick water, testing each step before committing their weight. Strange sounds echoed, the calls of birds, frogs, and unseen creatures. Moving cautiously to avoid detection, they sensed the dogs and hunters approaching the swamp's edge. Most hunting parties chose to circle, but one, led by Sutcliffe, entered on horseback, determined to prevent their escape. Halfway through the swamp, Sutcliffe's voice called out, "Benjamin, I know you can hear me. You're not getting away. Come back now. Devo promises only 30 lashes. Keep running and you'll hang all of you." No one answered. They pressed forward, moving through chest-deep water, past moss-draped trees, deeper into the swamp. Suddenly, Sarah, directly behind Benjamin, sank beneath the surface, caught in quicksand or a sinkhole. Benjamin grabbed her arm, pulling her up gasping, eyes wide with terror, and dragged her to slightly firmer ground. "We can't stop," Benjamin whispered. Despite exhaustion and fear, they had to keep moving. They continued through the swamp for another mile, finally emerging exhausted, soaked, and covered in mud and scratches. Behind them, the pursuit had faded. Either the hunters gave up or took another route. On the far side, the terrain shifted to rolling farmland with small homesteads belonging to free men who would report any runaways for rewards. Benjamin led the group in a wide arc around the farmhouses, sticking to tree lines and ravines, moving as silently as possible. With dawn about 2 hours away, they reached a barn where they expected shelter. From the road, it appeared abandoned, with sagging fences and overgrown fields. But as they approached, Benjamin noticed signs of recent activity: fresh wagon tracks, smoke near the chimney, and livestock sounds from within. He whistled softly, using a specific pattern he had been taught, and waited. A door opened, and a figure appeared carrying a lantern. The man was around 45, with graying hair and a weathered face, the mark of someone who had worked outdoors in all seasons. He raised the lantern, studied the group, and gestured urgently for them to come inside. "Move quickly," he said. "Patrols increase at dawn, and you've left tracks even in the dark. I'm Josiah Hendress. Get inside, and we'll discuss the next steps." They stumbled into the barn, warmer than outside and smelling of hay and horses. Hendress closed the door behind them, hung the lantern on a hook, and turned to count heads. "The others?" he asked. "There were supposed to be 7 of you." "2 split off," Benjamin replied, voice rough from exertion and fear. William and Elijah headed northeast toward Lynchburg Road. Hendress's expression darkened, conveying more than words could. That road was heavily patrolled every night. Planters from 3 counties had organized regular patrols after runaways from Buckingham had made it through the previous spring. The implication was clear. William and Elijah were in grave danger. Benjamin sank onto a bale of hay, head in his hands. They had escaped, yet the cost was immediate. William and Elijah were likely captured or dead. Sarah had nearly drowned. Even in temporary safety, everyone understood that this was only the beginning. 40 more miles lay ahead, each more dangerous than the last. Hendress brought water and cold cornbread, then disappeared into an adjacent room. When he returned, he carried a bundle of rough homespun clothing. "Change into these," he instructed. "Your current clothes mark you too clearly. We'll burn what you're wearing now." As they changed, Hendress explained the next stage of the journey. "You'll rest here until tomorrow night. No movement during daylight, the roads are watched. Tomorrow after dark, my brother will take you in his wagon about 15 miles north. You'll be hidden under hay and seed bags. If stopped, stay completely silent. Patrols have dogs, so we'll mask your scent with turpentine and tobacco leaves." "How many people have you helped?" Benjamin asked. Hendress paused, the weight of the answer heavy. "Enough that if I'm caught, I'll hang. White men don't get mercy for helping runaways. Last year, a farmer in Appomattox was caught hiding a family. He lost his property, received 50 lashes, and was driven out of Virginia. He was lucky. The enormity of their courage weighed on Benjamin. These people risked everything, their livelihoods, freedom, lives, to help strangers escape bondage. In contrast, men like Nathaniel destroyed lives for profit and entertainment. Sitting in that barn, Benjamin realized that the world held more possibilities than he had ever imagined. Meanwhile, William and Elijah were captured before dawn on Sunday, found hiding in a tobacco barn 6 miles from the Devo plantation. They were returned in chains to the main barn, where Nathaniel and Sutcliffe awaited. The enslaved community heard their screams, and the message was clear. Both men were dead by Tuesday, their deaths recorded as injuries sustained during apprehension and fever following capture. They were buried in the same unmarked section of woods as Thomas and the others, the county clerk filing the death certificates without question, having long accepted bribes from Nathaniel. Benjamin received news 3 days into the journey north. A free black woman acting as a conductor on the route delivered the message while they waited in a root cellar beneath a church in Appomattox County. Benjamin remained expressionless, though Sarah noticed his trembling hands. "They died because of choices I made," Benjamin said later that night, lying in the darkness. "They died because of Nathaniel Devo's choices." "Don't take that weight," Sarah said firmly. William and Elijah knew the risks. They made their own choice. What happened wasn't your fault. Her words stayed with him, a counterweight to the guilt that would linger for years. The journey to Pennsylvania took another week, each leg bringing new dangers and demanding courage beyond anything they had known. They traveled hidden in wagons, false-bottomed boats, and attics of seemingly abandoned houses, passing through networks of enslaved and free black people, Quaker families operating safe houses, and sympathetic poor white farmers. Not everyone made it. Rachel, a field hand who had worked alongside Sarah, fell ill with fever during the swamp crossing and was left at a safe house in the mountains, too sick to continue. Benjamin never learned if she survived, an uncertainty that haunted him alongside the confirmed deaths. The rest reached Pennsylvania on September 23, 1838, crossing the border in early morning fog that rendered the landscape dreamlike. They had traveled 22 days, covering roughly 200 miles through swampland, forests, and mountains. When Josiah Hendriss's brother guided them across the final stretch, confirming they were standing on free soil, the reality of freedom felt almost impossible to grasp. Benjamin settled in Philadelphia, where a large free black community offered protection from slave catchers and support for new arrivals. Benjamin found work as a blacksmith in a shop owned by a man who asked few questions about his past and paid fair wages. Sarah stayed with him, and they married legally, with papers recognizing their union in ways that had been impossible in Virginia. The ceremony was small, held in a church basement with just a handful of witnesses, yet it carried profound significance. The ability to make choices about their own lives. Isaac found work in a shipyard, where his youth and strength made him valuable. The three women who had accompanied them on the journey dispersed across the city, finding domestic work and rebuilding their lives. They remained in contact, meeting occasionally at the church where Benjamin and Sarah had married, sharing meals, stories, and the comfort of being among people who understood what they had endured. But freedom brought new burdens. Benjamin and the others were constantly aware that fugitive slave laws meant they were never fully safe, that slave catchers could operate even in free states, and that recapture was always a threat. They learned to be cautious about whom they trusted, to avoid situations where the absence of free papers could be questioned, and to always have an escape plan. The psychological strain of constant vigilance never fully lifted, subtly coloring even moments of genuine joy. Benjamin also carried survivor's guilt. The knowledge that he had escaped while 17 other men had died in Nathaniel's barn, that William and Elijah had been captured and killed during an escape he had organized, and that Rachel's fate remained unknown. In quiet moments, he would think of the men whose names he remembered, and those he had never known, questioning whether his survival came at the cost of their deaths. He knew it was irrational. He hadn't killed them, hadn't orchestrated the fights, hadn't created the system that destroyed them, but guilt rarely follows logic. Sarah helped him through these dark periods, reminding him that bearing witness was a form of resistance, and that surviving and speaking the truth honored the dead rather than betrayed them. Her encouragement eventually led him to speak publicly about his experiences, though decades passed before he felt safe enough to do so. Back in Cumberland County, Nathaniel Devo's operation collapsed within weeks of the escape. The manhunt had drawn attention from neighboring plantations and county authorities who had previously ignored rumors about the Saturday night fights. Questions were raised about the unusually high number of enslaved people who had died on his property, the wealthy men who had visited regularly, and whether the deceased Theodore Marsden had truly been there to discuss tobacco contracts. Hastings disappeared back to Lynchburg, cutting ties with Nathaniel to protect his own interests. Several regular spectators, concerned for their reputations, began spreading stories distancing themselves from the fights, claiming they had attended only once or twice and had been uncomfortable with the violence. The coordination suggested that wealthier participants had agreed to present a unified version of events minimizing their involvement. Nathaniel held one final fight night in late September, attempting to generate revenue, but only a dozen spectators attended. The excitement and sense of transgression that had made the barn profitable were gone, replaced by tension and caution. By the end of the evening, Nathaniel realized his enterprise was finished. The following week, creditors began foreclosure proceedings. Debts accumulated while expanding the fighting operation, combined with declining tobacco revenues, left him financially exposed. Without Saturday night income, he could not meet his obligations. By November, the plantation was auctioned, and Nathaniel relocated to Mississippi with whatever funds he had hidden, attempting to rebuild, though his reputation among those aware of the full story was permanently damaged. The barn remained empty for several years, avoided by the enslaved community on the new owner's plantation, and regarded with unease even by those unaware of its full history. Too much pain had soaked into the structure. In 1842, the new owner, Patterson, who had purchased the property cheaply, ordered it demolished. The wood was burned in a fire lasting most of a day, and the site plowed for wheat. Patterson never explained his actions, though workers claimed he had gone inside once, stayed for 5 minutes, and emerged visibly disturbed, saying only that the place made his skin crawl. Before his death, he gave an interview to a black newspaper reporter collecting stories from formerly enslaved people. He recounted his years in Virginia, the plantation, the fights, and the men who died. The young reporter, Frederick Hammond, was horrified and asked how Benjamin could bear to remember such things. "People ask if I ever felt guilty for surviving while so many others didn't," Benjamin said. "I tell them, no, survival isn't something to feel guilty about. What happened in that barn, what Devo did, that wasn't our fault. That was done to us, not by us. The guilt belongs entirely to the men who organized it, who placed bets, who watched and did nothing. Every man who entered that barn and wagered was complicit in murder. And they all walked away. That is what should haunt people, not that some of us survived." Benjamin paused, looking out the window of his small Philadelphia home, then continued, "I tell this story not for sympathy, but because someone needs to remember those men. Their names were erased, their graves unmarked, but they lived and suffered and deserve to be remembered. Thomas, Samuel, William, Elijah. I say their names because no one else will." The interview was published in Frederick Douglass's newspaper in 1876, a few months before Benjamin's death, but it drew little attention at the time. Reconstruction was collapsing, and the nation had little appetite for stories highlighting the brutal realities of slavery, while it attempted reconciliation between North and South. The article was soon forgotten, filed away in archives that wouldn't be seriously examined for another century. In the 1930s, a WPA project collecting oral histories from formerly enslaved people captured testimony from descendants of the Devo plantation community. Elderly interviewees, children in the 1850s and 1860s, recounted stories of the fighting barn and men who disappeared in the late 1830s. One 93-year-old woman interviewed in 1937 said her grandmother had told her about Saturday nights when screams from the barn signaled that someone was being destroyed for white men's entertainment. The interviewers noted the stories but did not investigate further, focusing instead on documenting daily life under slavery rather than specific, unprovable acts of violence. It was not until the 1980s that a graduate student researching Virginia plantation records discovered Nathaniel Devo's property ledgers. Noticing a pattern, 17 enslaved men crossed out between 1837 and 1839, with only 3 deaths officially recorded. The researcher, writing a dissertation on plantation economics, investigated further, uncovering Benjamin's 1876 interview, the WPA testimonies, and scattered references in neighboring plantation records to the events at the Devo property. A reconstruction of the story, based on fragmentary evidence, was published in a historical journal in 1989. The article received modest academic attention but remained largely unknown outside scholarly circles until renewed interest in the history of American slavery brought such stories back to light. Today, the site of the Devo plantation is partially preserved with a historical marker, though it makes no mention of the fighting barn or its events. The land has been subdivided and developed into homes, a shopping center, and a highway. The woods where the unmarked graves were discovered have been cleared, and the railroad spur long since removed. Nothing visible remains of what happened, except scattered archival references, recorded testimonies of people long dead, and oral histories preserved by descendants of both survivors and victims. The question that haunts historians is not whether this occurred. The evidence, though incomplete, is compelling, but how many other places like this existed? How many plantations, in how many counties, conducted similar operations, profited from them, destroyed lives, and left no records? Benjamin's survival and willingness to speak were exceptional. Most who endured such horrors either died or remained silent, unable to relive the trauma publicly. This story shows that the most egregious parts of history are often the most profitable to conceal, that official records reflect only what the powerful chose to preserve, and that truth relies on the courage of witnesses willing to speak even when few will listen. What do you think of this story? Has everything been revealed, or are darker details still hidden in archives, waiting to be discovered? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this exploration of hidden history and want more stories revealing uncomfortable truths, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who understands that we cannot move forward without confronting the past honestly. See you in the next video.